Hey guys, and welcome back. Now, let's begin things off with our quick introduction video. Now, obviously, you saw the video before this, and now let's take a deep dive into the introduction of the real world, guys. We're going to take a look at some recent hacks and vulnerabilities that have occurred in our world to date. We're going to look at some things that have happened over the last couple of years, and of course, we're going to take a look at some laws and industry regulations as well. I know it might be a little bit boring, but we need to know what's out there as well, and of course not to get into any trouble as well. So I don't condone any sort of damage that gets done. This is going to be the ethical approach to this series as well. So we need to know about the laws and regulations that exist, and yeah, so let's begin. So let's continue. Okay, so some recent hacks. So obviously when we think about some sort of hacks and vulnerabilities, basically a vulnerability is obviously an open wound, and we want to basically rub salt in that wound. So we find a system or a network that's vulnerable to something, and then we're trying to actively exploit it, which is basically what a penetration test is. And so some recent hacks that have happened in the industry, some big financial sort of hacks that have happened. One in particular was with Apple. And with Apple, I remember, there was a particular flaw with their iOS devices. You know, the Apple MacBook Pros or the devices and the iPhones and that sort of stuff. And in particular, there was a particular code in there, obviously in the system. And what that happened was with that code, it was actually entered in twice. Now, this was obviously by mistake, and I'm getting an Adobe um, update installer come up on my screen, so I'm just going to cancel that so I can see what I'm writing on the screen. And what particularly happened was a engineer actually entered this in twice. And what that happened was from there, it basically evaded or it overwrit that step. So, and what this step actually enabled us to do is when we're over here, this is us, and obviously we're connecting up to a wireless system, we've got a laptop or a phone or whatever. And let's just say we're going through a device and we're connecting up to the internet over here or whatever. And there's a particular server in the internet somewhere, such as your banking provider or, bank or Facebook or, whatever, event cinemas. And basically what would happen is when we make that connection out to the internet, obviously there's a SSL session going on. So we're going to make an encryption out to the internet. We're using TLS, transport layer security, obviously using HTTPS as well. And within that, it's obviously all encrypted. And what the problem was with the mutual authentication in this part was this sort of this flaw that sort of happened basically got rid of the HTTPS session to initiate. So when you're making that connection out to the banking provider or to whatever website that required any authentication, was basically out in plain text. So whatever you're connecting to basically overrid the step of us having a mutual authentication session with that server, and basically exposing all our information out to whoever's out there on that network. So if there was an attacker out there, and he'd be able to sniff that network out. If you were connected on the same wireless network as him or an internal corporate network as him, and he'd sniff out that information, then he'd be able to see banking records, financial records, obviously web browsing details, web browsers, web browser caching as well. And then he'd be able to basically keep all the information, cipher off the information, banking records. He can cipher off payments to his own banking provider. So it was pretty scary sort of attack that sort of happened as well. And that's what sort of happened, and I guess the CIO at the time had to resign over this issue because obviously it was a huge, big impact to the organization. And obviously, you didn't want that to happen. So a huge vulnerability and huge hack that sort of happened to Apple, which, as you can see, a large company like Apple would have great systems and services as well. But, the smallest things happen, and this is what happens. So we'll take a look at cyber terrorism as well, cyber espionage. Cyber terrorism, basically cyber warfare, when you have one nation or one sort of country attacking another country, instead of using, I guess, military or weapons of some sort, they're using sort of hacking attempts or, exploits of some sort, and the biggest one that sort of happened was around the Stuxnet. The Stuxnet. Now, for those of you that don't know about Stuxnet, Stuxnet was one of the greatest, I guess, worms that have hit the cybersecurity world. It was basically an Iranian platform that had all these generators on plant, and the whole building of the facility was using power facilitators and power generators to obviously to get power to the offices and that sort of stuff. And this particular threat was what we think a sort of a cyber terrorism, cyber warfare attack. It took years and years to sort of develop. It took years and years of financial backing as well through nations and other sort of leaders of organizations as well. It wasn't something that was created by, mums and dads or someone sitting at home coding something. It had very huge financial backing, had very huge resource capabilities as well. And they think it all started with, obviously a USB being left somewhere, someone plugging it in. And then that basically, created all these rootkits and worms in the system where the facilitators and the generators started doing their own thing. The problem with that was this particular worm was only affecting, the company over in Iran, right? They said that this particular worm wouldn't replicate anything outside of Iran, so it detected the Iranian system somehow, and then it was only native just to those sort of systems. So it was a huge, huge thing that went around. And I'll see if I've actually got. I'm just going to pause the screen and see if I can load it up in just one quick second, and we can go through it in a little bit more detail. And here we are. So for those of you that are interested to obviously know more about it, and I encourage you highly to read more about it. If you want to go over to sbs.com.au on demand and look at cyber war, you can obviously go through it yourself. But then there's a Stuxnet episode which goes for about 20 or so minutes. You can watch that. It gives you a bit of a granular sort of deep dive into Stuxnet, how it happened, and how they weaponized it to basically create it what it is today and what it was as well, which is quite very scary as well. So, So let's move on. So obviously, espionage comes at that level as well when you're spying on companies. Obviously, you create backdoors, create systems into those systems. And obviously you start tracing and following those systems as well. So we'll talk about corporate espionage as well. Obviously, privacy is a big one. Then we talk about organized crime units. The big companies like LulzSec, Anonymous, etc. All these sort of organized crime units are sort of wanting more of the financial sort of systems. They're wanting more financial benefits as well. They all have their own political views on events that happen in the world, and obviously they want to make a point and make some sort of statement as well. So obviously, most times, the 97% of times, it's for fun. It's for a challenge, but then obviously the other 3% as well is for any sort of monetary benefit, or obviously money involved in some sort. Then we're going to take a look at information security policies, as well. For those companies that don't have any information security policies, we'll take a look at the, just some cool things as well. And I'll bring this up as well so you guys can have a quick look. If you guys head over to SANS, SANS is a great resource in terms of policy and documentation templates as well. So you can go through these as well. They've got basically templates for everything. Obviously, no cost to anyone. It's free. You can basically substitute, the word name and put your own company, and then you can introduce these into basically the corporate company as well. And for those of you that haven't seen a corporate policy as well, here's your opportunity to see what it's like in the real world as well. So we'll just take a quick look at one. So this is the router and switch policy. Obviously, gives you an overview, a scope, a policy, IP address range, TCP services, web services, FTP services, anything that's sort of running. What the banner should look like when you're configuring the Cisco devices or any sort of vendor router switcher device. Obviously, Telnet and SSH. Obviously, you shouldn't be using Telnet at all. Getting rid of the Telnet and just going full blown out for SSH for remote and controlling into systems. Obviously compliance and regulations as well. So you guys can go through that in your own time. Just go into sans.org and then look at the resource and policies, and they're all there for you guys to have a quick look at as well. Now let's move over into a bit of the laws and regulations as well. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. We'll cover this, I guess, in our boot camp together. Just a real high level overview, guys. You don't need to know a lot about this. I'm just going to go through it at a very high level overview, nothing too granular. Obviously, the Spam Act in Australia has gotten totally rid of spam all around Australia. And that was a joke, it hasn't. But the Spam Act was just designed for that. So anyone that sort of opts in for any sort of marketing material or sales material has the right to obviously cancel and opt out of their marketing, and if they don't want to receive any more emails from particular systems. Now, I know there's been a particular where I was doing some testing with Pinterest, And I just couldn't opt out with it for whatever reason. They just kept sending me emails and emails after email after email, even though I've opted out of that system. So we had to put a policy down in place and obviously contact them and say, look, we need to get us removed out of your marketing system because we just opted out for that. And here's a spam act saying, if we're authorizing to get us out of access, then you should by law remove our access out of that. So just some systems won't actually remove you. Might have to contact them and then remind them about the Policy Act and Spam Act and all these other regulations and laws for them to actually do something as well. Then we'll take a look at the Cybercrime Act. The Cybercrime Act is basically in essence of, you don't have the right to access other people's machines and other people's software and other people's networks and sort of stuff. However, if you do that, then you will be prosecuted and you will be charged for any sort of damage or obviously Cybercrime Act as well. We'll look at the Australian privacy principles, and the Privacy Act just means, keeping things safe and secure. If you're doing something with the laws and the regulations, you don't want to sort of advertise information and that sort of stuff. I'm not going to go into too much depth about the Privacy Act, but that just tells us that all our data and information is safe and secure and that sort of stuff. So a bit about that. The companies that, and we'll take a look at the other sort of frameworks as well. Companies that, are in the banking or the finance space will have their own regulations that they have to follow. And by law, companies that are listed on the ASX will have to be compliant to the regulations of some sort, whether it's ISO or a COBIT sort of certification. Now, the ISO is the most sort of recognizable. ISO 2701. And ISO 2702 being more granular. 01 is just a high level overview for organizations, and 2702 is more in depth and detail. And then we've got obviously PCI compliance as well. So if companies are holding, credit card information, they have to be compliant to show shareholders and business units that they're actually doing the right thing and doing the best practice to keep the data and information safe and secure as well. And the ISO does that as well. So the ISO is a compliance standard as well. Then they'll show shareholders and customers that they have an ISO certification from, the International Standards Organization or International of Standards Organization. And by law, every year or every 12 months, they have to go annual penetration tests, which is stipulated in the ISO and that sort of stuff as well, which is quite cool. The government protective security policy as well. We'll talk more about that at a government level. Then they obviously use their own frameworks, information security manual, and then obviously their own policy. Now we've got the healthcare information, RICGP. It's just basically like the HIPAA in America, more of an Australian standard when you're holding sort of healthcare information as well. You have to abide by, the ISO or the COBIT sort of frameworks. As well. And then obviously the ACMA as well. And you guys can go through these in your own detail, in your own time as well. I'm not going to go through and cover them all today in more depth. I'm just going to talk about it in a high level sort of overview. And that's basically it. The Cybercrime Act, obviously unauthorized access, modification or impairment to any commit serious offense, possession of data without intent to commit offense, and unauthorized access to restricted data just means you can't access information if you don't have access to it. If someone hasn't given you written approval to break into their systems or to have access to their systems, then you're basically having unauthorized access to the system, and you have the right to then sue them or obviously take it further to the law and regulations as well. So it's quite daunting and scary. If you want to break into systems, you have to do it ethically and get written approval, testing the IP addresses, testing the systems, and getting proper in writing approval before we break into a system as well. And then you've just noticed the lights have gone off. I'm going to turn them back on in just a moment after we finish this video as well. And I think we're done. So that's pretty much it, guys. It's just a bit of a high level overview in this introduction. More fun will be coming up in this series. We're going to talk about scanning systems. How do we scan systems in stealth mode? How do we go on undetected? And how do we break into the systems and then create pivot points? And pivot points are awesome little gadgets where you can sort of compromise a particular host or a network here, and then you can once you gain access to him, you can then sort of see what network or system that's connected to, and that's connected to, and that's connected to, and then from there you can start maneuvering maybe down this path, and then seeing what's out there and what that sort of device is connected, or what this device is connected to, or what that device is connected to. And then instead of launching attacks, you can do what we call a side channel attack. And then what that does is, let's just say that you're sitting here, this is you, and you want to compromise a host that's sitting over here. You can basically launch an attack from this host to maybe this target over here, or from this target from there to that host, or whatever target and host that you want to sort of launch an attack from, not coming from you, so we can basically protect ourselves. And then we'll talk about proxy services and how we go through proxy services, so we can basically mask our identity over the internet as well. It's going to be so much fun, guys. I'll see you in the next video. We're going to talk more granularity, get more in the meat of this boot camp as well, and I'll see you guys very soon.